even though like it felt like I wasn't doing this physically, I was still able to see everything, and I would like see them moving, and like I just kept firing until like they stopped moving, and I would like aim at the head and whatnot.
So you're aiming at their heads?
Yeah, and when I saw they were still moving, because like even though I was like in this like type of thing, like I just didn't want them to be in pain at the same time.
The date was New Year's Day of 2018. This is Scott Kologi, and this video was recorded less than 3 hours after he had gunned down most of his family, merely seconds before they were all ready to celebrate the turn of a new year. And sitting right next to him was one of the only surviving members of his family, his brother, who, acting as his guardian, was forced to sit there and listen to how his life was destroyed in a matter of moments. However, as it turns out, there is far more to this story than meets the eye. In fact, long before the Kologi family met their unfortunate end, a storm had quietly been brewing, not just within the family's home, but deep inside Scott's mind. And let's just say that, as a result, this story will be sure to divide you. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and this is a wild story about a man who will either be called an evil monster or a vulnerable kid who never received the help he needed. Oh, and by the way, this channel is ran just by myself and 2 good friends. There are no corporations, no Netflix studios, and absolutely no AI slop. Just a small team that values real stories told properly. So, if you want to support channels like this one, then please do consider subscribing and maybe even dropping a comment for the algorithm. Thank you. And now, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Scott Kologi. But before we begin our story today, please be honest with me here. How are you listening to this episode right now? Is it maybe with a phone on the counter while you cook, an earphone hanging on for dear life, or maybe a laptop speaker's doing overtime? Because apparently, more than half of you listen in with either a mobile phone or a tablet. But are you listening with good audio quality? Whether you're someone who likes YouTube videos, podcasts, or simply music, you will know that audio quality really matters. And that's why I'm so happy to share that this video is sponsored by Raycon. Raycon's everyday earbuds are the perfect pair. They give you up to 32 hours of battery life, meaning you can literally binge an entire Coffeehouse Crime playlist, fly across the world, and still have battery left over afterwards. Oh, and by the way, the Earbuds Classic are loaded with incredible features too, including active noise cancellation, which blocks out those noisy environments, and awareness mode, which keeps me safe while I'm out running errands. They also come with multi-point connectivity, meaning that I can connect them to my phone and my laptop at the same time, which is great. And their new colours are such a vibe too. I went for carbon black because they seamlessly blend into my style, and their cases are beautifully refined too. With more than 4 million people already using Raycon, you know they're good. They also have a 30-day happiness guarantee, so if for whatever reason you don't like them, you can just send them back, and it won't cost you a thing. And because Raycon has gone big for Black Friday and Cyber Monday, you can get up to 30% off on Raycon audio products, making it the perfect time to support the channel and grab a pair for yourself. Or say it's a gift and then eventually keep it. But don't worry, I won't tell anyone. So, click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/coffeehousecrimeyt to get up to 30% off during Raycon's Black Friday and Cyber Monday sale. That's buyraycon.com/coffeehousecrimeyt. Thank you Raycon for sponsoring this video, and thank you to you folks for supporting this channel. Now let's get straight back to our story today. We begin today in Long Branch, New Jersey, which is home to around 30,000 Americans. Here, the air is clean, seafood is quite clearly in abundance, and the place tries to forget its grisly stories. To be honest, it's the last place you'd expect something like this to happen. But that's the thing about places like Long Branch. The quietest corners can often hide the darkest secrets. And as 2017 drew to an end, one more terrible secret would be carved into its history. Among the many families who called Long Branch home was the Kologi family, and by all accounts, they were normal, warm, close-knit, and deeply loving. Their home, which was found on Wall Street, was the kind of place where family birthdays were celebrated big, Christmas was magical, and Sunday dinners were sacred. The family consisted of 2 parents, Stephen Kologi Sr., aged aged 42, and Linda Kologi, aged 44. And together, they were the kind of parents that most kids would be sincerely lucky to have. They were supportive, attentive, nurturing, and endlessly devoted to their kids. Between the two of them, they raised 4 children, that being their eldest son, Jonathan, their daughter, Brittany, and their 2 younger sons, Stephen and Scott. But the family did not stop there, because Linda's younger sister, Michelle, and her husband, Richard, both lived downstairs in the basement apartment. Meanwhile, the family grandfather, also named Adrian, and his long-term partner, Mary, were always found to visit the property on most days of the week, especially when it came to holidays and celebrations. It was a house that was full of life, and, by most appearances, full of love. But saying that, in that warmth lived someone who was quite undeniably different. You see, Scott, who was one of the youngest of the children, had been diagnosed with development issues at a very young age. And so, with these additional challenges, he attended a special education school which was tailored to helping students who needed that extra hand. And so, as a result, his social world was, unfortunately, incredibly small. You see, he never really spoke to any children outside of his family, and even when he did, he struggled to relate to them. Looking back actually, I think one of his older brothers described it perfectly. Scott just didn't act like any other 16-year-old. Not only was he supposedly innocent, sheltered and isolated, but he still believed in Santa Claus, and would sleep in his parents' bedroom every night. Now, naturally, this meant that both of his parents were extraordinarily protective, especially his mother. I mean, not only would Linda dress him every morning, but she would even cook him separate meals just to his liking and monitor him very carefully. However, love, as deep as it ran in the family home, was simply not enough to hide their concerns, because deep down and underneath the surface, there were unspoken fears. You see, the family had long suspected that maybe there was something more going on with Scott, and I'm not talking just simple development delays here. I'm talking about something far more worrying. Now, this manifested in very strange ways because, at least in Linda's mind, it was likely the possibility of a tumor. And although it was never diagnosed, she still believed that maybe that was the cause for all of these additional weird behaviors. What doctors would later determine was that Scott likely fell heavily on the autism spectrum, and his symptoms were pretty obvious too. He showed strong obsessive-compulsive tendencies, had difficulty interpreting social cues, and emotionally, well, he just seemed to live in an entirely different rhythm. Scott could be incredibly flat at times too. He could be quiet and serious, but always gentle and always passive. It is worth noting here that no one had ever seen him act violently. Not once. As for his behavior and how people outside of the family saw him, well, they all said that he was polite, calm, and basically invisible to outsiders. And that's because his world would revolve mostly around books, television, video games, and family. And that was basically it. And although he wasn't that emotionally expressive, he did seem to love his parents and all of his siblings. From the outside looking in, the Kologi family were doing everything right for Scott. They gave him structure, affection, and, importantly, protection from the outside. However, what they didn't know is that while the Kologi family were wrapping Scott in this warmth, his inner world was unfortunately growing cold. And what no one seemed to realize, or perhaps even refused to face, was that something was shifting deep within him. Over the years, the signs had subtly increased. You see, Scott had started experiencing hallucinations. Strange thoughts began to take shape, and he talked about disturbing urges that he didn't know how to control. You could describe them as visceral feelings which he couldn't explain. Now, the family would chalk most of this up to just Scott being Scott with his general quirks, and they would even hope that eventually he would grow out of it. However, the reality was far more dark and far more sad, and while the Kologi family smiled and persevered on, Scott's mind was slowly unraveling. In the years leading up to 2017, Scott had started to think about hurting people. And I'm not talking about just in passing or in fleeting moments of frustration with someone, but seriously, deliberately, and without any reason whatsoever. And most chilling of all, these feelings were consistent. In fact, for most of 2016 and 2017, Scott had even been fantasizing about hurting his family. And these were not just violent passing thoughts either, but methodical conversations that Scott would have with himself. His aunt, Michelle, would later admit that whenever Scott was having a bad day, he would say things like, "I have bad thoughts." And when she would ask him what he meant, he would tell her that he was thinking about hurting people. Understandably shaken by this, Michelle would often confront her sister, Linda. She begged her to seek help for her son, either by speaking to a doctor or taking him to a therapist. But unfortunately, Linda would always refuse these offers, and instead would simply brush them away as if they weren't an issue. It is hard to tell why precisely, but the main theory is that she simply didn't want to see Scott as someone who could possibly be so dangerous. In fact, she would even take it one step further with Michelle when she told her not to tell anybody else. Not the school, not the doctor, and certainly not the authorities. Because if somebody outside of the family actually realized what Scott was thinking, well, he may be questioned, institutionalized, or even taken away. Now, Linda was not malicious in her intentions here. You could tell that she deeply cared about her son, and all she wanted to do was protect him. But tragically, she also believed that love alone would solve all of his problems. Now, apparently, at one stage, Scott had even asked his mother if he could speak to the school psychologist because he was having violent thoughts about hurting the kid next door. And Linda's response, well, unfortunately, she flat out refused. Not only that, but she even banned Scott from speaking to the therapist again. And that consistent decision, which, by the way, was made from a place of pure and innocent maternal love, may have been the curse that sealed the family's fate. The thing is that Scott's thoughts were not merely impulsive or passing, but they were persistent obsessions. He also confided in both his aunt and his grandfather about this, but again, no one raised the alarm. In fact, his family even bickered about this from time to time, and that still didn't go anywhere. For example, in October of 2017, Jonathan texted his mum to say, "Adrian says that all Scott talks about is killing people. It was just another chilling warning." But unfortunately, Linda still didn't act. Instead, she hoped that this was a phase or a dark joke or even just a weird teen thing. And it appears that even Scott would try to pass it off this way too. For example, it was during a family board game that October that he picked up a small gun-shaped object before then pointing it towards his aunt and uncle and saying, "I'm going to kill you." They laughed about it, but quite nervously, because, well, what else are you gonna do? But the terrible thing is that Scott was not actually joking, and his thoughts were not mere fantasies anymore either. And that's because not only had he started hallucinating, but he seemed to be planning things in his mind too. Now, here is a very interesting part of the story. But Scott would also often talk about these strange, reoccurring visions. And one of the most terrifying details of this included Scott often seeing a pinkish blob staring at him from the neighbor's window, kind of like a ghost or a figure, but without a face. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there either, because Scott would also tell his parents that he often saw a transparent woman floating into the ceiling. He would also see faces appearing all over his bedroom walls, and voices were always whispering to him from the stairway. Really terrifying stuff, and things that would be sure to leave me feeling like I'm in an endless nightmare. There is something that I would like to share with you here. There's an Instagram account that I randomly came across the other day, and no, this isn't a sponsor, by the way, but the user, Sorad Magical, has tried to imitate what it's like to live with hallucinations and schizophrenia. It is genuinely insightful, and from this reel, you can even gather what it's like for Scott too.
With this one chicken, don't forget you need to pick up cat food, don't forget. You already have this basket. Water is really pretty here. It's like an infinite memory waves, crystals.
With everything said, it is clear to see that Scott's internal world was fracturing. and for whatever reason, the people around him were slowly becoming threats in his own mind. As a result, Scott had become paranoid and even convinced that others might hurt him. A school evaluation would eventually suggest that Scott possibly might have ADHD and maybe even some kind of brain anomaly. However, nothing came of it, and to be honest, I think that diagnosis was probably a little too weak. The Kologi family continued to care for Scott at home. However, they didn't push for any further psychiatric evaluation, and that is probably because they did not want to believe what might be happening to their son. But sadly, the signs were all there. Now, quite curiously, the Kologi family even had a history of mental health issues. For example, the grandfather on one side of the family was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Meanwhile, a grandmother on the other side was diagnosed with a personality disorder. In fact, even Scott's sister Brittany had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It was all around them, but strangely, Scott was never diagnosed. By the end of the year, Scott was still deeply paranoid, deeply obsessed, and still slowly sinking. Yet, to the outside world, everything still seemed fine. And that included that fateful day of December the 31st, 2017. So, it was on this day that the family were quite naturally planning their New Year's Eve celebrations, just like they did every year. And there was no change to this year either. They all decided to have their usual family gathering. It was a full house that day, including Stephen Sr., Linda, Brittany, Jonathan and his girlfriend, Aunt Michelle and Uncle Richard, Scott's grandfather Adrian, and Adrian's companion Mary Schultz. There were 3 generations of the family here, all with party hats and party drinks, and food which had been laid out in the kitchen. It was the kind of night where you'd take plenty of pictures. Except, by the end of this one, well, you better hope that none were taken. Upstairs, Scott was planning something else. At around 7:30 p.m, and while his family started their party downstairs, he pulled out his phone and made several searches on the internet. This included, can a bullet from an AK-47 pierce body armor, terror attacks, and preparation theme music. After that, he began to read an article about the 2017 London terror attack, before then moving on to flat earth conspiracy theories. It seems that Scott was not acting on impulse here. Instead, he was mentally preparing and calibrating. Unfortunately, it just so happens that night, the family home contained an American-made semi-automatic AK-47. The gun belonged to Scott's older brother, and although it was typically kept away in a locked safe, it unfortunately wasn't on this particular day. In the months and years leading up to this tragic event, the safe had slowly begun to rust away, and so the AK-47 had been moved into a nearby closet. Not only that, but the ammunition was both nearby and ready, and Scott knew exactly where everything was. Actually, it turns out that Scott had been obsessed with this weapon for weeks. Throughout December, he had watched multiple YouTube videos about AK-47s, studied how to handle them, and even learned about what attachments could be used. It is clear that he had grown fascinated, and now, the moment had arrived. At some point during the evening, Scott quietly slipped away again, before then heading upstairs and retrieving the rifle. He then loaded it with bullets, armed himself with a second magazine, and then even put in foam earplugs for his own protection. He then slipped on a black jacket, put on some sunglasses, and then just stood there in the darkness with all of the lights off, waiting for anyone to come upstairs. It was only a few minutes before midnight that Linda headed upstairs to get her son. The turn of the new year marks a significant milestone, so it makes sense that she wanted him to be there with the rest of the family. But sadly, by then, Scott had already made his mind up. The very moment that Linda opened that door and, without a word, Scott turned around towards her and opened fire. Neighbors later reported hearing what they described as popping sounds just before midnight. However, these were not fireworks. Linda was struck multiple times at close range. Seconds later, she collapsed just outside of Scott's bedroom, bleeding out in the upstairs hallway of her own home. Severely wounded, her final moments alive were likely filled with confusion, pain, and heartbreak. Moments later, Scott's father, Stephen, ran upstairs to find out what was going on. And of course, what he found at the top of the staircase was beyond comprehension. Scott then raised the rifle and fired multiple bullets through Stephen's chest, abdomen, and head. He died instantly. Downstairs, chaos erupted, and family members and guests who had been partying only moments earlier were now scattering in panic. Scott's aunt and uncle sprinted for their lives, diving into the basement before then escaping out the back door. This, of course, saving their lives in the process. As for Scott's older brother, Jonathan, he burst through the front door and then ran into the night, horrified. Meanwhile, his girlfriend ran into the kitchen in search of shelter. Inside the kitchen, she found Brittany, Scott's sister, Adrian, and Mary. And it's clear that none of them had any time to process what was going on, because none of them thought about running out the back door. Meanwhile, Scott himself was making his way downstairs with the rifle in his hands. Those still alive described his demeanor as stern and emotionless. He didn't scream, rant, or even say anything, and behind those sunglasses, his face was blank and cold. The very moment he entered the kitchen, he found Mary, and unfortunately, he was not prepared to give her mercy. After shooting her in the abdomen, Mary collapsed on the kitchen floor, and tragically, she too would die from that wound. Nearby, Scott raised the weapon at his sister's face and then pulled the trigger. Brittany was hit once in the face and once in the chest, and she died almost instantly too. In what was later calculated as just under 2 minutes, Scott Kologi had murdered 4 people, that being his mother, his father, his sister, and a beloved family friend. But then, all of a sudden, and surprisingly, Scott suddenly stopped. Standing in the same kitchen where he had just murdered his sister, his grandfather Adrian stood there just entirely dazed. Apparently, when he saw the pain in his grandfather's face, it pulled him out of his daze. And so, whether it was a moment of clarity or a break in his twisted logic, that is when Scott decided to lower his weapon and finally end the killing spree. In total, 14 shots were fired, and just as quickly as it began, when all was said and done, Scott simply put the rifle on the ground and then calmly walked back upstairs. Meanwhile, outside, Jonathan had already run to a neighbor's house and dialed 911, and now sirens could be heard approaching in the distance.
Attention all staff supervisors, 635 Wall Street, 635 Wall Street, cross to Oakwood and Long Branch. Police shooting, scene is not secure.
Thankfully, police officers arrived within several minutes. Multiple callers had reported an active shooter inside the home, and so officers entered the crime scene with their weapons drawn. As they advanced, one officer shouted, "Police, show me your hands." And from the stairway, a calm voice could be heard saying, "I'm upstairs." Scott emerged onto the landing with both of his hands visible. He then gave himself up without resistance.
Police say a family New Year's gathering turned into a quadruple homicide around 11:45 last night. Neighbors heard the gunshots from down the street.
I came outside last night about midnight to look and see what was going on. I would say I'm pretty sure that was gunshots. So I looked outside before, you know, a cop down here, cop down there, lined up around the street.
The Monmouth County prosecutor says a 16-year-old fatally shot his mother, 42-year-old Linda Kologi, his father, 44-year-old Steve Kologi, his sister, 18-year-old Brittany Kologi, as well as a family friend, 70-year-old Mary Schultz. This is a photo of the Kologis and their 4 children in happier times. The prosecutor says the grandfather and a brother were in the home, but unharmed. The prosecutor says the suspect used a Sentry Arms semi-automatic rifle, and a family member legally owned the gun.
We will be charging this individual with 4 counts of murder and 1 count of possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose.
Scott's actions not only ended the lives of multiple family members, but also ruined New Year's Eve for thousands in Long Branch. I mean, the shooting was quite simply unbelievable, and as those details trickled out to the community, well, they all felt shocked and distraught. However, before any of that happened, and while the community was still out there celebrating New Year's Eve, Scott had finally been arrested. I know this is going to anger some of you here, but despite his age, Scott waived his Miranda rights away and even agreed to speak to detectives without a lawyer. I think whether you're innocent or morbidly guilty, everyone will always agree that you should always obtain a lawyer first. Except Scott here I'm pretty sure he had no idea what he was doing. Now, in a cruel twist of fate, because Scott was still technically a minor, officers were still legally required to obtain consent either from a parent, which wasn't going to happen, or a guardian before they could begin. And tragically, the only available guardian that evening was Scott's older brother, 20-year-old Stephen, who of course had just witnessed him murder more than half of his family. What Stephen did next was incredibly brave, because not only would he agree to be Scott's temporary guardian, but he would even sit in during his interrogation. And I have to say, it was probably one of the most heartbreaking things I've watched.
I know they're all, well, deceased.
How do you know that?
Even though it felt like I wasn't doing this physically, I was still able to see everything, and I would see them moving, and I just kept firing until they stopped moving, and I would aim at the head and whatnot.
So you're aiming at their heads?
Yeah, and when I saw they were still moving, because even though I was in this type of thing, I just didn't want them to be in pain at the same time.
All right, so let me rewind a little bit. So upstairs, your mom walks in, all right?
Opens the door.
Opens
She
the
didn't
door.
walk in yet.
So the gun was loaded already.
Yes.
How many times do you shoot her?
I would say 5, 7 times.
Where do you shoot her at? What part of the body?
And then the torso and chest.
All right, and then your father hears the shots and he comes up?
Yes, and then it was his back.
His back?
Yeah.
All right, and then you walk down the steps
Yeah.
with a gun loaded and you go in the kitchen.
Yeah, and then the rest.
How many times do you shoot your sister?
3 times.
Where do you shoot her at?
Well, she was sitting down, so it was kind of chest and head region.
And who's the other person you shot?
Got a grandmother.
Your
Mary?
grandmother.
Yeah, chest region.
Chest region?
Yeah.
How many times did you shoot her? You were
4 times, I believe.
4 times.
And I know, because I had the things in my ears, it was muffled, but, it was also because I wasn't there fully.
When you were loading the mags and when you were doing this, there
Yeah, I
was...
was, questioning it, but I just, couldn't stop. It was, something subconsciously, I had to do it.
Did you feel anger?
At certain moments, yeah.
Okay.
Just
You said something before, and I want to make sure I
What?
remember it correctly to ask you about it.
Hmm.
You said something about you weren't really mentally there?
No, when everything was going down, everything was happening, it felt like I was watching it, it felt like I was, further back in my mind, I could still see it, and I knew I was doing it, it just felt like it wasn't me.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yet you knew what you were doing.
Yeah.
You know what time this happened at, right? You remember the time?
It was around 12, because it was
It was before the actual New Year, right?
Old truck.
So it was around, what, 11:30, 12, around there?
I would say 11:58, 59. I don't know.
Did you do that on purpose?
What? I was thinking around that time.
Happy New Year
Yeah.
type of- What time did you think of doing this at? Or did how long have you been planning
I don't
this?
know. But mainly a day. I just saw
Were you thinking about it all day today?
yeah, pretty much.
So you were thinking about going to get your brother's gun and shooting everybody up?
Yeah.
When describing the murders, Scott spoke to officers with extreme detail. He confessed everything both openly and honestly, and without any remorse whatsoever. Meanwhile, you can see his brother struggling with his own emotions and, of course, his monumental pain. Of course, Scott would then tell the story precisely how it was, that he'd been harboring violent thoughts for well over a year, and also that he wanted to inflict pain on his bullies, a neighbor who had allegedly wronged him, and even his entire family. When pressed about hallucinations or voices, Scott said that apparently he didn't recall having any that night. However, he did mention seeing a white light outside of the window before the shooting. Whether it was a hallucination, a firework, or simply a trick of memory, we can't quite tell. But what he did say with absolute clarity was that he already knew that what he did was wrong. And when detectives asked him why he didn't shoot the dog or the cat, Scott simply said that they were not doing anything wrong to him. He then followed up his answer by asking a question himself. That simply being, can I go to a mental hospital instead of jail, please? As Scott was led out of the interrogation room and then charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, the questions surrounding this case only grew heavier. I mean, obviously he was troubled and he had an extraordinary history of disturbing thoughts, so there was the argument of insanity here. But also, he was articulate, rational, and deeply aware, and so began a long legal, psychiatric, and moral war on what to do with Scott. But before I continue with this video, what do you think about Scott Kologi? Do you think that he was this cold-blooded evil killer? Or do you think he was this vulnerable boy who was trapped inside a fractured mind? Well, let me tell you, this is actually the main reason I want to talk about this case today, because as tragic as this story may be, the psychology behind Scott's mind is truly fascinating. So, let's split this case into 2 very different professional perspectives. To begin with, Dr. Senior Santina is a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Scott twice, once in 2019 and then again in 2020. Not only had she spent hundreds of hours with him, but she also combed through his records and studied his psychological history. Her ultimate conclusion was that Scott suffered from early onset schizophrenia, and that his descent into psychosis had started long before the night of the murders. It is noted that, as far back as his childhood, Scott reported perceptual distortions, shadowy hallucinations, and a constant sense that something was deeply off inside his mind. She also described how Scott had seen red demonic faces, floating women, and transparent figures that randomly appeared and then vanished inside his bedroom. Now, none of these things were passing nightmares or teenage anxiety, but instead they were, in her own words, odd perceptual experiences consistent with psychotic symptoms. And of course, there was also the voice that Scott heard, because at one point, he reported hearing that voice whisper, "Welcome to the side of evil." With all of this in mind, Dr. Santina believed that, on the night of the murders, Scott had entered a dissociative episode which detached him from reality. To her, this was the fractured experience of a schizophrenic mind, and not simply a cold-blooded murderer. She therefore testified that Scott was legally insane at the time of the killings, and that, furthermore, he couldn't distinguish what was right from wrong due to his psychosis. And of course, this meant that, under New Jersey law, he should not be held criminally responsible. To further support this conclusion, she pointed to a family history that was riddled with mental illness. All of the genetic pieces, in her view, were there, and the family's illness had simply taken root in Scott the deepest. However, not everybody agreed with her findings. In fact, even Dr. Santina herself admitted there were gaps. She did admit that she had never prescribed any medication for Scott's schizophrenia, and perhaps even more critically, that most of her diagnosis rested on self-reports. To challenge the defense team's claims of schizophrenia, the prosecution brought in one of the most well-known forensic psychiatrists in the United States. And I am even sure that some of you know who this guy is, because of course, it was Dr. Park Dietz. If that name sounds familiar, it should, because Dr. Dietz has testified in some of the country's most high-profile criminal trials. This included Jeffrey Dahmer, John Hinckley Jr., and countless others. And in the case of Scott Kologi, Dr. Dietz left no room for doubt. Not only did he not believe that Scott was schizophrenic or psychotic, but he didn't believe that he had a tumor that impaired his thinking either. Instead, he diagnosed Scott with autism spectrum disorder, which was further marked by obsessive-compulsive traits. According to him, Scott wasn't delusional at all. Instead, he was seen as rigid, socially awkward, and highly rule-bound. He also said that, at most, Scott may have experienced a brief psychological phenomenon called depersonalization, which is a form of dissociation. However, Dr. Dietz was also quick to clarify that dissociation is not insanity, and according to him, Scott absolutely knew what he was doing. He highlighted his methodology, which included his research, his preparation, and his long wait in the dark. To him, this was not the behavior of someone who was lost in hallucinations or even trapped in any sort of psychotic spiral. Instead, it was plain and simple. This was intentional. The jury's task here was huge because they would basically have to determine if Scott was guilty or insane. and over the days of testimony, they would hear professional opinions on both sides. But in February of 2022, and after less than 5 hours of deliberations, the verdict finally came in. They found Scott Kologi guilty on all counts of first-degree murder and a weapons charge. And Scott, who was now 20 years old, sat in silence as the judge imposed one of the harshest sentences ever given to a juvenile. He received 150 years behind bars. By law, he has to serve at least 127 years and 6 months of that sentence before even being given a chance of parole, which basically means, yeah, he's not ever walking free again. Now, of course, his defense team would argue for leniency, trying to insist to the judge that mental illness was the driving force for these murders. Off the back of that, they tried to apply for a minimum 30-year term instead, pointing towards his age and his psychological struggles. However, as recently as this year, 2025, his appeal has been denied, and to be honest, it's not likely to ever change. Now, if I'm honest with you, the case of Scott Kologi leaves far more conflicting feelings than it does resolution for me. I mean, the warning signs had always been there. We're talking hallucinations, dark jokes, and desperate pleas for help. Yet, even still, there was never any sort of real intervention. And I think that's probably why Scott's outcome does not quite sit right with me here. Personally, I don't think the justice system was fully understanding of his mental state, and they certainly discredited the fact that this young teen had been asking for help for years. Help which also seems to have been shut down by his parents multiple times. It is obvious why too, because out of love and fear, his mother hid his struggles because she was terrified that he'd be institutionalized. In the end, she was only trying to protect him. However, that may have also sealed the family's fate. And ironically, he is now somewhere that is much worse than an institution. Now, don't get me wrong, because I do believe that, whatever the situation, Scott should not be free and mingling with the public, because it's obvious that he is undeniably mentally ill and an extreme danger to the public. However, it does seem that he lived in a blurred reality and was haunted by delusions and paranoia, and also, he was consistently asking for help. So, is prison really right for Scott? Well, I think the bar for illegal insanity is impossibly high, and I think it also depends on how much you believe he fits that category. For the surviving Kologis, the aftermath was completely unbearable. Jonathan and Stephen Jr. lost nearly everyone: their parents, their sister, and, in a way, their brother too. Adrian buried his own son, daughter-in-law, and partner all at the same time, and now they are left only with memories and with questions that will never fade. The Kologi family did so much right by Scott. They loved him, supported him, and tried to give him a normal life. But unfortunately, love alone wasn't enough here, because when mental illness is ignored or stigmatized, the consequences can be absolutely catastrophic. I think Scott's story is quite a tricky one, because although I don't sympathize for him, I do recognize that there were plenty of mental health issues, and while I think it's easier to just simply call him a monster and lock him away, I think what's more important is to try to understand why all of this happened, and there really doesn't seem to be a motive here outside of his own mental health struggles. Those are just a few of my thoughts anyway. But of course, I'd like to end this story on saying how sad and sorry I am to hear that the Kologi family are now half gone. This truly is a heartbreaking story. Before I go, I'd love to know what you think about this case, because I really do think this is one of those special stories where it is really hard to understand the motive. So, on that note, what do you think about Scott Kologi? And do you think he received the punishment he deserved? And with that said, I think that's pretty much the end of the video today, folks, but thank you so much for tuning in today. Thanks again to Raycon for sponsoring this video. For up to 30% off, go to buyraycon.com/coffeehousecrimeyt. As always, if you want to support the channel, then please do consider subscribing. You can also find me on social media, most notably on my Instagram here. And don't forget, we are now on Spotify. And yeah, that's pretty much it today, folks. Thank you again for watching, and as always, I'll see you again very shortly for another one, likely next week by now. Anyway, thank you again, and in the meantime, make sure that you look after yourselves and each other. Oh, and stay safe and stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.